Howdy, everybody. So today we'll be talking about James Madison's presidency, kind of the brief beginnings of it, and then how it quickly turns into the War of 1812, and we'll do a quick overview of the war and what kind of happened, the main points of the war. So James Madison has just become president. So following up after uh, Thomas Jefferson, kind of continuing on this Jeffersonian mindset. But very quickly, he is being inundated with attacks by the Warhawks. So, as you've seen in your reading, the first term of Jefferson went really well. The second term was full of a lot of conflicts with the British and a lot of issues. Warhawks like John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay are basically pushing the president to try to go to war with the British. Basically, what they're saying is if the British don't respect us, we need to go to war, or we should just give up and become a colony again. So give up being a colony or go to war. Those are the only two options they're giving Madison. Now, Madison will hem and haw and try to not go to war. We don't have the money, we don't have the resources, nor do we have the army of defenses to really face off against the British. Remember, the American Revolution, we barely won. Like, we won only because the French came to our aid and because we wore out the British. So, we have a lot of pressures on James Madison to go to war. And these pressures are going to come to a head with Tecumseh and his brother, Tenskwatawa. Now, Tecumseh had a vision for many of the Native Americans kind of in the northeastern part or northwestern part of the United States, or what the United States was at the time, which is right around the Great Lakes. So Tecumseh was the political and military leader, while his brother, Tenskwatawa, was kind of more the spiritual leader. Now, Tenskwatawa had been the town drunk, but then had a revelation, a vision, and he saw a unification of Native Americans driving white colonists off their land. So Tecumseh was the political component, really rallying the forces, and his charisma was able to bring many tribes together that had often fought amongst themselves, many nations together that had never really allied before. And it was becoming a serious threat to the United States, particularly for our desires to expand westward. Now, we sent a guy named William Henry Harrison out to the Great Lakes area, the Illinois area, to really try to talk to Tecumseh and get him under control. Now, Harrison was a U.S. officer, and his job was, fight them if necessary, but try to talk them out of it. So when Harrison and Tecumseh met, there's kind of one iconic meeting that kind of shows how smart and charismatic Tecumseh is. So they're sitting on this big log. It's basically like a big long bench kind of log. Harrison on one side, Tecumseh on the other. They're talking, debating. Harrison's basically saying, why? Oh, we don't have to fight. We can figure this out. We can buy your land. We can do something to come to some sort of peaceful reconciliation. And Tecumseh's arguing, no, that's not great. But the true beauty of his argument is as he's arguing, Tecumseh, every, 2, 3, 5 minutes, scoots a little closer to Harrison. So after, an hour of talking, Tecumseh is practically sitting on Harrison's lap, having scooted down slowly across the whole bench. And at this point, Harrison's like, man, Tecumseh, we have a whole bench. Scoot out. Like, scoot back to where you were. Like, don't encroach on us, on my little area. And Tecumseh's like, exactly. That's exactly what y'all are doing. Y'all are encroaching on our area. Just leave us alone. And this is when Harrison realizes, oh, crap. This guy's smart. He's charismatic. He's not only a good leader, but he can persuade people and make an argument, both physical and kind of verbal, at the same time without me even noticing it. So there is a fear. Now, this is when Tecumseh decides he's going to go a little further south to try to recruit more Native American groups into his alliance. And he gives his brother, Tenskwatawa, an order. He says, whatever you do, don't fight the Americans. They attack, retreat, and get away. Don't fight them. Now, Harrison had been paying attention to Tecumseh. That was his job. So when Tecumseh went south, they're like, now's our chance. We'll hit his kind of main headquarters and main base of operations and weaken him while Tecumseh's gone. His brother, Tenskwatawa, was supposed to run when Harrison attacked, if he did. But instead, Harrison fought. And this results in the Battle of Tippecanoe. So this is 1811 to 1812, kind of that winter summer area. So you have the Battle of Tippecanoe. It is a huge defeat for Tecumseh's forces. Now, Tecumseh's not there to lead them, it's Tenskwatawa. And Tenskwatawa believed that he could summon up the spirit of their ancestors to kind of serve as a spiritual armor to defend them from American attacks. Fortunately, it did not work the way Tecumseh hoped. And the troops are defeated and they retreat. And then where they retreat is going to be kind of the problem. They retreat back behind some British forts, and the Americans realize, okay, these guys are retreating towards the British. They found British-made weapons amongst the Native Americans, so Harrison and many Americans conclude the British are sponsoring the Native Americans to fight for them against the United States. That's why the Indians are fighting us. Not because they're mad at us for us taking their land, but it's because the British are making them do it. So there's kind of this blindness in America that the Indians are upset at what we're doing. Instead, we prefer to blame the British. While the British were egging them on, the Native Americans had real grievances against the United States. But nonetheless, this gives the Warhawks enough leverage to pressure the president, James Madison, to finally declare war on the British. So we're going to kind of do a quick run through. I'm not going to talk about this too in depth, but a quick run through of the war. So right as the war is kicking off, you have an election of 1812. So Madison wins with a pretty strong margin, but pay attention to the group up here, kind of in New England, that all voted against Madison. And keep in mind, this is the same area that's being hit the hardest by the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act. Their economies of shipping have been effectively crippled. Their economies are gone. So they don't want this war. They want things to go back to the way they were. So the first big idea of the Americans is, okay, the United States loves being an independent nation. Canada is occupied and controlled by the British. So the United States gets a bright idea, let's invade Canada. And that'll trigger an uprising of Canadians. They'll revolt and help us kick out the British, and then Canada will join the United States. That's the vision. Well, we attack Canada several times trying to invade Canada. And the Canadians are like, no, we're good. We're fine being British. And they fight with the British against the United States, and every single invasion goes very, very poorly for the United States. So things are not great. We have several minor battles on the Great Lakes. We do okay on the Great Lakes themselves. These are naval battles. But ultimately, the invasions of Canada never go particularly well. The one big battle we do win is the Battle of Lake Erie. Now, this is impressive. We actually take a full warship apart from the coast, from New England coast. We take it apart, drag it across land to a Great Lake, put it back together, and actually use that boat to fight in the Great Lakes. So we have a decided advantage over many of the British ships, oddly enough, that aren't able to get into the Great Lakes because we moved one of our bigger ships into the lake piece by piece. But the ultimate invasions of Canada always go poorly. Now, to kind of give you one example of these invasions, you have the Battle of Queenston Heights. Now, this is led by a guy named Winfield Scott, and his name is going to be very important going forward. He's going to be a prominent general in the United States. Now, Scott had about 2,000 regular troops, so professional soldiers was their job 100% of the time. Then he had several thousand more militiamen. These are those volunteer troops that come in to fight only in times of war. Well, during the invasion of Canada, Winfield Scott and his first wave of troops, those regular professional soldiers, crossed the river, the St. Lawrence River, into Canada, began fighting, trying to establish a beachhead. The rowboats, after they dropped off the first round of troops, while they were fighting, went back to pick up the militia troops. Well, the militia sees the fighting across the river. The boats come back, and they're like, we're not going. And Winfield Scott's like, what the hell? Where are my reinforcements? And the militia's like, no, we'll fight to defend America, but we're not crossing the river to invade. So he had this army that wouldn't fight. and will only fight under certain things, under certain criteria. And this is the fundamental problem of the U.S. Army at this point in time, is you have this small core of a really good, well-trained thing that's the legacy of Washington's army, that Continental Army. But then you have this reliance on this vast portion, 70%, that were militia troops that were democratic. They tended to want to vote instead of follow orders. They wanted to make their own decisions. They wouldn't fight in certain places and certain times. It was very difficult to get them to do what you needed them to do. And as a result, the Battle of Queenston Heights was a huge defeat because 2/3 of Winfield Scott's army wouldn't fight the battle. They wouldn't cross the river and fight. No wonder we couldn't invade Canada if our army wouldn't even invade. So this was a huge defeat for Winfield Scott and the U.S. Army. By this point, the British are finishing up fighting a different war. They're fighting the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, and we thought, oh, they're distracted with that war. We'll start the War of 1812 and kind of jab them in the ribs a little bit and take what we want from them. Well, they defeat Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo and turn their forces at the United States. So there's Winfield Scott as he would have looked during this battle. So at the Battle of the Thames, this is another one of those along the invasions of Canada. Not a significant battle. We got defeated. But what does happen at the Battle of the Thames is the colonists, or the United States, the Americans at this point, are able to kill Tecumseh, causing his alliance to fall apart. Because Tecumseh was really the key. While they lose the Battle of the Thames, they do kill Tecumseh, and that does weaken the British because they lose a vast portion of their Native American allies. So there's the death of Tecumseh. So Napoleon has surrendered after Waterloo. He's sent off to be imprisoned on an island. And the British counterattack. After all these failed invasions of Canada, the British and the Canadians marched an army through the entirety of the United States, from Canada all the way to Washington. And they burned the White House to the ground. Now, this is a close thing, because as James Madison is sitting down to eat dinner, a messenger comes and runs in and says, oh dear God, the British are coming, like they're right there, like they're outside the city. So the meal, still warm, they just abandon and leave. And James Madison's wife actually grabs the only portrait we still have that was painted of Washington while he was alive, and they flee, just leave everything as it is. The British take the city, they sit down, many of the officers sit down at James Madison's meal, still warm, eat his meal. Then they burn the White House to the ground. Now, technically, the White House at this point in time was like a pastel pink. The house that'll be rebuilt in its place will be kind of whitewashed, where we get the White House we know today. Now, what's worse is not only have they burned our capital to the ground, but shortly after the burning of the White House, a storm hits the capital, and you have lightning and thunder and allegedly tornadoes. So it looks like God himself had turned against the American people. So many people were kind of seeing this as a bad sign for how the war is going. They've destroyed our capital. They forced our president to run away. Our army can't win anything. Nothing's going great. The United States is not doing well, a year into this war. And this is when the new hero is going to arise, a guy named Andrew Jackson. Now, we'll talk more about Jackson later when we get to Jackson and his presidency. But Jackson hates the British. He hated the British during the American Revolution. He was a child, had a lot of bad experiences. The British treated him very poorly. He had a big scar on his face from where an officer slapped him in the face with the blunt side of a sword. So he has no love of the British. So when it came to fighting the British, he's going to be ruthless and fight tooth and nail. However, his first fights are actually against the Native American allies in the South. So this is the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And he's actually able to trap the Native Americans in their village on this kind of little peninsula. It's called a horseshoe bend because it's a horseshoe bend of a river. They build like this barricade. You kind of see a diorama-ish picture here. They barricade it, and Jackson uses his own Indian allies to sneak around the river at night. And they sneak around the river, go all the way around the village, and cut away and send down the river all of the canoes. So there's no escape for the Indians. The next day, the U.S. troops attack, cross the barricade into the city, and utterly and completely destroy and devastate the Native American village. So this is not necessarily a glorious victory because it involved a small massacre, but this was a victory for the United States, and we were pretty desperate for any victory. Now this is where some weird stuff happens in the war, because a series of events are going to happen. They're going to occur chronologically, obviously, because it's time, but the United States hears about them out of order. So while Andrew Jackson is fighting and getting ready to move towards New Orleans with his army, the British and the Americans make a treaty called the Treaty of Ghent to end the war. Now in December of 1814, they have this treaty. But keep in mind, in order for this treaty to end the war, that news has to get back to the Americas. And that could be anywhere from 3 to 6 months, depending how long and how fast they move, how long it takes to cross the ocean and how fast they can get there. So, Treaty of Ghent, 1814, technically ends the war. Okay, so this brings us to our second event that's happening almost exactly at the same time as the Treaty of Ghent's being signed, the Hartford Convention. So the Hartford Convention is the New England states, those that have been hit hard by Jefferson's Embargo and Non-Intercourse Act. So their economies are wrecked. It looks like they're losing the war. They're the ones that are having armies march through their areas because they're bordering Canada. So they're thinking, well, maybe we should break from the United States and make a separate peace with England. So create our own little mini country, do it on our own. And at the time, it looks like it might be a good idea because nothing's going well in this war, so maybe we should do this separate idea. So you have a treaty happening, then you have this group thinking maybe we should become traitors and break from the United States, and at the same time, there's a third event happening. So you have the Battle of New Orleans, January, February of 1815. So that's just 1 month. So within a month of this happening, the treaty being signed, plus them, the Hartford Convention proposing separation from the United States, you have the Battle of New Orleans. Now, this is the British proposing to invade New Orleans, one of our most important cities, and try to capture it. Well, Andrew Jackson gets wind of this, so people notify Andrew Jackson when they hear about the invasion, and Jackson hastily moves his army to New Orleans, sets up, you can kind of see the little squiggly line on the plains right outside of New Orleans, where Jackson's going to set up his defensive position. Now the British, they kind of bungle this whole invasion. It doesn't go real well. They don't have the right type of ships, so they can get their ships up into kind of the Gulf of Mexico, kind of right off the coast, but they don't have the kind of small flat bottom boats that they need to get all the way up just to the outskirts of New Orleans. So instead, they're trudging across, the soldiers are trudging through swamps, fighting their way through this hard evidence, or all this hard environment, just to get to the battlefield. Now, Jackson is able to defeat the British. It's a pretty resounding defeat of the British. But this victory is going to muddle the whole effect. While it's great for the United States, we won a battle, technically it happened after the treaty was already signed. So let's look at the outcome of the war, the actual order of events versus how America understood the order of events. So the actual order of events. So you have the Hartford Convention and the Treaty of Ghent occurring roughly simultaneous, both in December of 1814. The next month, you have the Battle of New Orleans playing out. So you have a proposed treasonous activity, Hartford Convention, a treaty that ended the war, and then the Battle of New Orleans, which was the biggest, most successful victory of the whole war. This is what makes America feel great after this war. Now, the American perception of events is going to dictate not only how we perceive the war, but how America itself begins to behave on the greater world stage. So we hear about the Hartford Convention first. Newspapers pick up on it. It's happening in New England. They spread it along the colonies. People think, oh crap, they're thinking of leaving. Shortly thereafter, They get news about the Battle of New Orleans, this massive success. Andrew Jackson defeating one of the biggest British armies, this big invasion, saving the city, becoming a hero in his own time. So it makes the Hartford Convention people look like horrible, evil traitors that never should have done this. They're like, oh, we were about to win the war when you proposed treason. So the Hartford Convention people made up a lot of the Federalist Party are going to basically be seen as an enemy. So the Federalists basically die as a political party. Then, shortly after the Battle of New Orleans, the Treaty of Ghent, news of that arrives in the United States. Now, in reality, the Treaty of Ghent was signed before the battle ever happened. And regardless of if we won or lost the battle, the treaty was already signed. However, because we heard about in the United States the Battle of New Orleans prior to receiving the news of the Treaty of Ghent, most Americans are like, oh, we won the Battle of New Orleans, therefore we forced the British to surrender and give us a treaty. Not how it happened, but that's how we understood it. That's how we perceived it. And that perception is going to change how we view the war. So let's talk about some significances of the war. So military changes, you have major generals coming to prominence. So Winfield Scott, which we talked about, Andrew Jackson, who's going to become president, and then a third general, which we'll talk more about later, a guy named Zachary Taylor. He's actually going to be president later on too. You have the death of the Federalist Party due to the Hartford Convention. So we're down to a one-party nation. Only the Republicans are left. You have this new wave of nationalism because we think not only have we won a second war against the British, kind of confirming our independence, but it's the first time as a collective we're starting to see each other as a single unified nation rather than a confederation of states. And because we feel that we've defeated the British, the most powerful nation in the world, a second time, we're going to start acting like we're badasses when we're really not. The British were just tired of fighting us. They had been fighting Napoleon for, 5 to 10 years. They didn't want to fight us. We were an annoyance or a thorn in their side. They just wanted us to go away. But we perceive it as a massive victory because of the Battle of New Orleans, and we start acting like we are a world power, even though we're not. But the problem is we're going to fake like we're a world power for so long, we actually become a world power without anyone really noticing it. And this is where we get kind of the true significance of the war, is that we begin acting like we're much bigger and better than we actually are. But in the time that everyone's kind of ignoring our behavior, we actually grow into a much more powerful nation than people would have ever thought. And this results in what's known as the era of good feeling, where you have this 10 or so year period where we only have one political party. People are willing to work together, sacrifice, personal regional interests for the betterment of the nation. But this is ultimately short-lived. It only survives as long as the economy is doing well. The first economic downturn, people start focusing on themselves and their region again, and things go poorly. But we'll stop there for today, and we'll pick up with our next video later.